begin the book of Ruth today. The emphasis is on the word try. Ruth is kind of a bridge between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel. So we'll take an initial stab at it today, and then we'll continue next Sunday. But just a word about Ruth, just to kind of prime the pump a little bit. So one way to kind of think about the Old Testament is to think about the Old Testament as actually containing a variety of voices and themes. And Ruth's a good example of this. So we've been hearing, right, all the way through Joshua and Judges about how bad the Canaanites are, right? They kind of get a pretty bad rap. Probably it's deserving. But nevertheless, right, they've been painted in pretty dark colors. Ruth is a dissenting voice because, as we'll see, Ruth is a Moabite, that is, Ruth's a Canaanite. And yet she's the star of this show. And we'll see why. But the point right here is that after hearing about how bad all the Canaanites are, now, lo and behold, we have a story about a Canaanite woman who's actually an example of faithfulness. So we'll have to kind of put those two themes together, right? One way to kind of, I think a good analogy here is thinking about it this way. This is another kind of dissenting voice. The book of Deuteronomy, right, makes it clear that, you know, the evil people always suffer, good people are always vindicated. That's kind of the way things work. The book of Job is a dissenting voice to that theme, right? Job's a righteous person who undergoes like a horrendous amount of suffering. So once again, we have a theme and a sub-theme, and we have to kind of find some way to put those two things together. So let's take an initial stab at the book of Ruth. I'm going to read the first part of the first chapter to you, and then just say kind of a few things about it. Now, Ruth is kind of like a short story. That's probably the way we would talk about it today. It's brief, 4 chapters. It's got a little bit of plot, a little bit of character development. So we'll want to take a look at all those things. So here's how the story starts. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. So there's our plot, right? So we're starting off in Israel. There's a famine in the land. And this man who's from Bethlehem takes his wife and his 2 sons, and they have to leave Israel because of the famine. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Okay, so there's famine in the land, the whole family pulls up stakes, moves to Moab, and that sets things up for the next thing that's about to happen. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. So tragedy number 1, right? Here we have a case of a woman who's lost her husband. And remember, right, from our reading back in Exodus and Leviticus, remember, there was a special provision made for 3 different kinds of people who were thought to be the weakest people in society. Remember who they were? Widows, orphans, sojourners. So Naomi has just fallen into one of those categories. Naomi is a widow. She has no husband. And so the question is, okay, how's she going to support herself? And most of us are probably kind of thinking, well, at least she's got the 2 boys, right? They can maybe help her. So that's where we we stop with that. But then this. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with their 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the women were left with, the woman was left with her 2 sons, was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So notice it's like a string of tragedies, right? Tragedy number 1, famine in the land, they're forced to leave. Tragedy number 2, husband dies. Tragedy number 3, the 2 sons die. And so now what we have is we've got like 3 widows. And not only just 3 widows, right? We've got an Israelite widow, and we've got 2 Canaanite widows living with her. So this is almost like, almost like kind of the worst possible scenario that you could kind of think of, right? Everything that's really bad that's, could go wrong basically has. And so that's kind of why Naomi is something of a Job character here, because everything has gone wrong. Now, the question right now is, okay, what are they going to do? How are they going to address this situation? So here it is. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So famine comes to an end in Israel, word gets back to Naomi, she decides it's time now to go home. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, listen to this carefully, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept, and they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, and go your way, for I am too old to have a husband." So basically Naomi says, okay, look, y'all need to stay here and find Moabite husbands, right? I'm not going to have any more sons. It's kind of like too late. So you need to kind of stay here and hunt for a husband if that's what you're looking for. Now, 2 words here that are really important, and we're going to find here that words here in Ruth are really significant. I want to focus in for a minute on Ruth 1:8, because 2 words occur here, or actually 1:8 and 9. 2 words here that occur. They're going to be really, really important for thinking about this book. Naomi says to the 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Now, there's a really important word that occurs here that I'm going to want to say just a little bit about. And the reason why I'm going to spend some time on it is because it actually turns out to be one of the central themes of the book of Ruth. This word here that's translated in the ESV as "deal kindly" occurs again in Micah 6:8, where Micah says, "Do justice, love kindness." That's the same word here. That is, we have a Hebrew word here that's very complicated and very multidimensional. And so what I'm going to do is, throughout our time in Ruth, is I'm just going to use the Hebrew name rather than trying to translate it into English. And the reason why I'm going to do this is not because it sounds like, fancy and like I really know what I'm talking about if I drop in a Hebrew name every now and then, but because the name is like so multidimensional, it's probably best to leave it untranslated. And the word here that's used is hesed, or if you want to pronounce it correctly, chesed. H-E-S-E-D, with a hard H, chesed. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important for a couple reasons, because hesed here is a word that you can't really adequately translate it by the English word love for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is that in the Old Testament, Hesed is the Old Testament's favorite word for describing the love of God, where it means something like covenant, loving faithfulness. And the thing I really want to stress here is Hesed has no connotation of like emotional feelings or sentiments. Okay, that is, when we're told that God has Hesed toward his people, we're not being told that every time he looks at the people of Israel, his heart goes pitter-patter because they're just like so sweet. No. We're told that God's love for his people, that covenant-loving faithfulness, actually has nothing to do with them, but everything to do with him. That's why I think this word is so important, right? Hesed here means that you're faithful and loving and kind to someone, not because they evoke in you like a lovely emotional response, right? Where you look at someone and say, how can anyone not love Bob? It's actually almost the opposite, right? Well, Bob's like really unlovable, but I'm going to treat him well anyway. Okay, so this word hesed is like really, really important. It's used to designate the fact that God's love is not prompted by anything lovely in us. It's actually driven by his own goodness. That his hesed is a product of God's own goodness. It is not a sort of measure of our sweetness or our lovability. I think probably the best way to kind of think about this is that great passage in Romans 5. Remember where Paul says that how is it that God's love is revealed to us? In Christ's death on the cross. Right? God's love is revealed to us in his son's death on the cross. By which, right, Paul wants us to understand, right, that when he's talking about God's love, he's not talking about God having a sentiment. Right? Jesus' death on the cross is not simply about God going, they're so sweet. They're just lovely little people down there. I really need to do something nice for them because, you got to love them. No. So we'll be using this word hesed here. And the thing that we'll want to watch, and this is kind of like a preview of coming attractions, right? The thing that we'll want to watch for here is Ruth is kind of like a deceptively simple story, right? You can kind of read Ruth as kind of something of a love story, boy meets girl, they fall in love, they get married, they live happily ever after. All their children go to Stanford, and they all end up driving Subarus or something like that. But that's really not the purpose of the story. One of the really important kind of sub-themes of the book of Ruth is this. One of the sub-themes of the book of Ruth is that God's own unique love, hesed, comes to us not only directly from God himself, but it can also be poured into our lives through other people. As a matter of fact, the idea is that God's people are actually called to practice hesed as a way of reflecting him. Okay? We got a little bit of this in the gospel reading this morning, right? Remember, because we're supposed to what? Love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, because what's the significance of that? It reflects God, right? That's the idea. So that's one of the really important themes of the book of Ruth. So hesed here is an action, not merely a sentiment. One way I think to understand this is, and this is something I always remind couples who are going through the premarital process, right? Remember, in the Book of Common Prayer, there are the wedding vows, right? And that is, right, you're promising to love someone, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until you are parted by death. So the thing I always point out, right, as people are going through the premarital process is that notice two things about that promise, right? First of all, it's an unconditional promise, right? You're going to promise to love someone until one of you dies. That's pretty unconditional. But notice, right, that promise that in the marriage covenant, right, is designed to be reflective of God's love for us, a la Ephesians 5, right? That Christ loved the church and gave himself up for that she might be washed and sanctified, and all those other sort of things. And the second is this, right? Notice, there's nothing in that promise about feeling something. That is, you're not saying, I promise to love you or cherish you or be faithful to you, so long as I feel like doing that. So long as you make me happy or, I find you pleasing. No. You're actually promising not to feel something. You're actually promising to do something. You're not promising to feel loving because no one could promise that, right? That would be impossible. It would be impossible for anyone to say, you know what? For the next 40, 50, 60 years, I'm going to feel totally, absolutely loving toward my spouse. No one can make that promise, or at least no honest person can make it. If you were like self-deluded, you might be able to make that promise, but otherwise, no. What you're promising to do, right, is you're promising to behave faithfully and lovingly, which is a different thing, right? You're promising to do something even when the feeling might not actually be there, right? So that's an important thing. So that's the importance of Hesed. Now, let's take a look at what happens next, and this will have to be the last thing. So Naomi's told them to turn back. You're going to do better here than you will back in my country. So, I'm not going to be hurt if you let me go back by myself. That's all right. So notice what Naomi says here in Ruth 1, 12 and following. Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband, this might and should bear sons. Would you therefore still wait? Were they grown? That is, Naomi says, well, I suppose I could have a couple more sons, but guess how long you'd have to wait before they grew up so you could marry them. And by that time, right, they probably wouldn't want you. That doesn't sound good. Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Now, really, I said words are important. Ruth, or Orpah, says, okay, yeah, you're right, Naomi. Goodbye. Ruth stays behind, and we're told clings to Naomi. Once again here, the word's really important. The verb that's used here is the same verb that's used in Genesis 2:24, where we're told that a man shall leave his father and mother and will what? Cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So, once again, okay, the Moabite, this awful Moabite, we all know that all Canaanites are awful, don't we? This one clings to her mother-in-law. And this is what she says. This is some of the most dramatic words in the whole book, and this is where we'll stop. But Ruth said in Ruth 1:16, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. And here it is. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so, and to me more so, if anything but death parts me from you. Footnote here, that's actually one of the possible Old Testament readings for the marriage liturgy, obviously, right? So just a brief word here. Notice what Ruth is saying. Ruth is saying, in effect, without explicitly using the word, right, Ruth is actually promising to practice Hesed to Naomi. I'm not leaving you. Your home's going to be my home. Your people's going to be my people. Your land's going to become my land, and your God is going to become my God. I am clinging to you. I am not going to let you go. Now, we'll see that there's a really important theme that's about to work itself out here, and that is Naomi is going to call attention to the fact that her name in Hebrew means bitter. So if you're planning on having a daughter in the near future, don't name her Naomi. Okay, find find something else, okay? But we're gonna learn here, right, that Naomi believes that God has abandoned her, that all these bad things have happened to her, that she has like a real reason to be bitter. We're gonna find out that there's a reason why she's wrong. And one of those reasons is going to be Ruth. So, after having given previews of coming attractions, we'll wait for next week.